Grace, thanks for joining us.
Thanks
we are
for
here
having
to
me.
talk about this book, Stolen,
My opus.
your magnum opus. So give us a sense of what the overall narrative is. What are you telling us in this book?
The main argument of the book is effectively that the crisis that we had in 2008 wasn't just a banking crisis. It was the kind of structural crisis of an entire way of organising the economy. And I call that way of organising the economy finance-led growth. So the first part of the book charts the emergence of that model. So it looks at how it kind of grew out of the collapse of social democracy in the 1970s, and then analyses how it's affected each different area of the economy. So we look at the financialisation of the corporation, of the household, of the state, and then the crisis itself. And after that, there's a kind of section looking at the economic malaise that we've experienced since 2008. So, we've had a decade of wage stagnation, productivity stagnation, low investment, rising poverty, all those sorts of things. And then a manifesto, as you called it, to get us out of it.
How do you reassure people that you could actually change the system on a national basis and not pay a huge price in the global market?
Yeah, so the price that you're talking about really when you start to imagine some of the things that I've laid out in the book. So say you properly regulate the finance sector, you impose a lot of macro-prudential regulation. We're talking about credit controls, exchange controls, that sort of thing, and do a lot of other stuff that maybe the bond markets don't like. Say, properly reverse austerity, a Green New Deal, a 4-day week, all these sorts of things that Labour's currently looking at. You get two potential reactions from financial markets. The first is capital flight, and the second is capital strike. Now, with regards to capital flight, that's potentially going to take place in the run-up to any election. So there's not a lot you can do about that, but after an election, you can introduce, and I argue for the introduction of exchange controls, so qualitative capital controls, which are kind of taxes on currency flows in and out of a particular state. And there's fairly easy mechanisms through which you could do that. And even the IMF recently has suggested that actually, in some cases, the use of capital controls is acceptable. So that's even within the kind of, mainstream orthodoxy. That's not
it would still be seen as quite radical.
It would definitely be seen as quite radical. And Labour has kind of consistently signalled that it wouldn't do that. But that is potentially an option. And it's an option that could be made viable almost as soon as coming into government. I think the second issue, capital strike, which is kind of related to capital flight, requires a longer-term solution. And I think the longer-term solution is a much greater role for public finance in the economy. So that means a public banking system. It means a national investment bank, public retail banking. I argue in the book for a people's asset manager, which would kind of be a state and a socialised investor in the economy. And over the long term, that takes a lot of the power away from private finance.
So imagine that you actually won. You are then facing potentially capital flights that you yourself are predicting during a general election campaign. You've got to have a huge nerve that you've got to hold throughout that process. And I think a lot of politicians would balk at that, because if you're actually seeing kind of maybe not full-on runs on banks, but you're seeing real scare signs in an economy, you're going to want to change course or soften it or reassure.
I think that we are living through and this is a part of the argument of the book as well, we're living through a kind of moment of extended crisis. And Gramsci has this quote that in the kind of interregnum between the death of the old and the birth of the new, all sorts of morbid symptoms appear, right? And so you do get political chaos, economic stagnation, kind of social breakdown, all these different interrelated problems. And that's what ultimately leads to demands for really systematic change.
The issue I had with this book is that I was sort of half with you, and then I felt there was a lot of politics there, that you had to kind of be, you actually didn't mention Brexit or Trump in it.
Deliberately.
But I'm sure, but in terms of the values of what you're talking about, which is that the kind of overly globalized world means that nation states can't make their own decisions, can't control their own, what kind of societies they want to build, this kind of exaggerated dominance of bankers and sort of technocratic institutions. You talk about rule by experts at one time, which has some slight echo of the Gove complaint against experts. You seem to be against kind of technocracy, and actually it sounds like quite a Brexity book.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because obviously I've kind of said in the past that I'm in favour of leaving the European Union because I think a lot of the rules. I mean, take for example that question of exchange controls. Obviously, capital mobility is one of the 4 freedoms. That's not something that you would be able to do outside of a really severe crisis within the European Union. The same goes for state aid rules, etc. Brexit itself doesn't have to be some sort of, extreme event, but there are people that would like to use it in order to change the economy in various different ways.
So in which case Brexit is a massive opportunity to change the country in the way that you're talking about. In fact, it would be totally impossible to do the changes you're talking about without Brexit.
I think it's an opportunity and it's a risk, right? And it's the same thing, it's the same thing as what you were saying earlier about, the reforms you're arguing for could potentially lead to also a kind of cataclysm if, you get capital flight and all these different things. Any big shift from the status quo is going to generate risks, right? And this is why I put such emphasis on the Thatcherite transition in the book. Because when Thatcher decides we are moving towards a very kind of free market economy, we are deregulating the financial system, we are cutting the size of the state, etc. She has to go through a period of deep political and economic turmoil. Unemployment reaches 3 million. She literally uses the state to effectively wage a kind of war against the country's union movement. There's a period where many in her party basically think, it's difficult to see how she could possibly survive this because of the kind of the harm that she's inflicting on society, right? And she pushed through that. She pushed through the harm that she was inflicting on ordinary working people in order to get to the position that she wanted to get to, right? In the same way, if the left has to push through, it's not just going to be worth it. It's like the only way out.
So I just wonder whether, what you think about a different kind of coalition, which is not just sort of going back to that kind of the working people must rise up against the financial elites, but actually looking across the aisle and saying, okay, there's a centre blob here that is obsessed with, international finance and the existing, what you would call neoliberal way of doing things. But at either ends, there are people who have deep misgivings about it. Can you see a cross-party or cross-political axis coming together to try and achieve some of these things?
I think the reason for the focus on class is that this is a kind of Marxist analysis, right? And so therefore it relies on the idea that the only way to build a stable and lasting coalition is to build one based on people's material interests. So you have to have a large enough coalition that has a material interest in moving beyond the status quo, i.e. they will all be made better off in one way or another. They have a kind of just deep-rooted, almost a kind of existential need to move beyond the system because it is making them worse off. That's, I think, the basis for the long-run coalition and for the movement that would have to underlie this project. In terms of an electoral constituency, I agree with you. And actually, I think that, when this message has been successful, obviously in 2017, there was a kind of increase in support for Labour that, over the course of the election, it was the largest turnaround in opinion polling that we've seen, in decades. And I think partly that obviously came as a result of, lots of young people switching over. It was, some people giving their vote with Labour because they didn't want to support Conservative Party Brexit. But I think it was also on the back of the kinds of people that you're talking about, because I kind of know quite a lot of people like that, because they often ask me to kind of come and speak at their events or, address clients or whatever. And people are very, very curious about alternatives to the status quo because they know that as it stands, and I think climate change, the climate crisis is particularly high in people's minds when they think about this, that our economic model just simply isn't sustainable. So I think people are really curious about these alternatives.
Climate crisis and Brexit. That's why I felt I would have liked more about Brexit in this, because this is not necessarily uniquely a left-wing instinct. And you talk about the Occupy movement and these earlier movements. Well, Brexit, in a sense, is the latest incarnation of that same rejection of neoliberalism, of sort of untrammeled globalization. And actually, I would argue the Trump phenomenon is as well, at least in part a rejection of neoliberalism and globalization. So those voters are your friends. Can we hear about them a little bit more? Yeah, no,
I completely agree with you on that front. And I think, the task for many on the left at the moment, and particularly socialists, is taking that deep-rooted and almost instinctive pushback against the financial globalization of the last 40 years and transforming it into a viable political project. Because at the moment, I think that anger is often kind of manifests itself just as a kind of, visceral, like, there's been too much immigration, right? And that's obviously the perhaps most obvious result of the globalization of the last 40 years.
Literally the face of
Yeah,
globalization.
literally. But I mean, it's not, often when you kind of end up talking to these people in more detail, it's not really what they're angry about. They say, oh, I'm annoyed because, immigrants are coming over here and they are taking up our hospital places, our school places, etc. And when you get down to it, it's the NHS isn't working for me. We don't have enough social housing. We don't have enough, our public services are not working. I'm on a very low wage on a 0 hours contract. I can't afford to make ends meet. And those kinds of concerns end up coming into a kind of reactionary lens when there isn't an alternative narrative. So it's the task of kind of taking those concerns, taking them seriously and saying, yes, you're right, financial globalization, the untrammeled mobility of money all around the world, the massive power it's given to the top 1%, and by the way, their friends in political institutions and in the state, has made you worse off, and we need to push back against that.
Take back control could almost be the motto of this book.
It really is. And I think that I feel really, really viscerally that sense that people are really angry at the way in which they are rendered voiceless in all of the institutions that affect their lives. So in the workplace, at the level of their communities, in public services, just in politics more generally. And that is why that kind of call to action was so powerful when it was mobilized by Leave. Even when you ask people today, a lot of people will say, I wasn't really that bothered about, the specifics of the European Union. I wanted them to listen to me and to know that we still have this power and we can use it. So I think in many ways, taking the principles of political democracy, we obviously need a massive reform of political democracy in itself, but extending those into the realm of the economy and saying, people should be in control of their workplaces. People should be in control of their public services. Accountability and direct democratic control are so important.
And on that, you weirdly have quite a lot in common with Dominic Cummings and the Circle Around
I know,
Brussels.
it's really funny. I did this interview with Douglas Carswell a while ago, and we disagreed on everything except for the fact that we need more democracy, right? I think that is in many ways one place where socialists and some people on the right have something in common, because often the left is decried as, oh, you just want the state to take everything over and to tell everyone what to do. But no, democratic socialism is about giving people power back over their lives. And I think that is something that resonates really strongly across the political spectrum.
And you're not going to be standing in this next election?
I will not, no.
Confirmation. All right.
Yeah, you've got it first.
Scoop. Thanks, Grace.
Thank you.